The ridge lay quiet beneath the brittle frost of early winter, the kind of cold that clung to the lungs and made every breath feel like it was carried on glass. Calder Rourke had been up since before dawn, stacking firewood against the north wall of his cabin, moving with the steady rhythm of a man who had long ago given up waiting for the world to give him peace. 5 years had passed since the war ended, but in his bones it still raged. A limp followed him with every step, a crooked echo of a bullet that never truly left his flesh. Worse than that was the hollow ache left when sickness claimed his wife and the unborn child she carried. Town had nothing for him after that. Only pity, only questions he didn't want to answer. So he built a home from pine logs and stone fenced in a patch of land, dug his own well, and tried to keep the ghosts at bay by working until his hands bled. That morning the sun was pale and slow to rise, spilling weak light across the frozen grass. Calder shifted a log onto the pile and straightened, pressing a hand to his knee as the joint flared with pain. He muttered low under his breath, though not loud enough for anyone to hear. No one ever did. The ridge had been his solitude for so long that silence had become its own companion. Yet even in the hush of winter air, he felt the faint prickle of something, movement at the edge of his vision, a shape crouched low near the tree line, about 30 yards away. He stilled, heart ticking faster, eyes narrowing. It wasn't the sway of a deer or the quick dart of a fox. The figure was too small for a grown man, too still to be an animal. Calder set the axe down carefully and stepped forward, boots crunching through brittle frost. As the distance closed, the form sharpened into the outline of a child. She was huddled behind a fallen stump, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tight around her thin frame. Her hair was tangled, her face smudged with dirt, lips cracked from cold. No coat, no shoes. Apache by her features, though she could not have been older than 7 or 8. Calder crouched slowly, lowering his voice as though speaking to a spooked horse. "Hey," he said. The girl didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her eyes stared ahead, glassy with exhaustion, her jaw trembling, but no words rising. When Calder reached out, she remained motionless, too far past fear to even fight. He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her narrow shoulders. The weight of her bones startled him. They felt hollow, breakable. She smelled of smoke and earth, of a long road walked alone. Lifting her gently, he carried her back across the field, the frost crunching under his steps, the silence pressing heavy around them. Inside the cabin, the fire still smoldered from the night before. He stoked it to life, set the girl on a bearskin rug close to the hearth, and pressed a tin cup of warmed water to her lips. She drank quick, desperate sips, as if afraid the water might vanish. Calder spooned out the remains of beans and cornbread from the pot and broke them into small pieces. She ate fast, both hands working crumbs, scattering down her chin, still silent. He didn't ask questions: where she came from, how she ended up here. Those answers would come in their own time. For now, keeping her alive was enough. When her stomach was finally full, she curled into the blanket, his coat pulled tight around her shoulders. Her head rested against the hearthstone, and within moments her eyes slid shut. She slept with a heaviness that told him she hadn't done so in days. Calder watched from the table, arms crossed the fire's glow, flickering across her small chest, rising and falling. Questions bit at him. Was she lost, abandoned, or worse, driven from something darker? His gut twisted, yet even as unease gnawed, he felt the stir of something he hadn't known in years: responsibility. A reason, however small, to keep the fire burning through the long night. He dozed in his chair, rising often to feed the flames, listening for sounds beyond the cabin walls. None came. When dawn crept gray through the cracks, the girl still slept, her face slack with a kind of fragile peace. He cleaned her feet with warm water, wrapped them in strips of wool, and laid another blanket over her body. Outside, the chores waited, cattle lowing for feed, the pump stiff with frost, but his eyes kept straying back to the closed door, watching, wary. Whoever this child belonged to, they would come. And when they did, he didn't know if they'd arrive with gratitude or with fury. 2 days passed in this uneasy rhythm. The girl ate what he gave, drank from his tin cup, and answered nothing. He learned only by observation. Her eyes followed the flames, as if she measured safety in their light. Her hands curled always near her chest when she slept, her breath shallow but steady. He began to think she had been left behind on purpose. Still, he kept her because he couldn't bring himself to set her outside. On the third morning, while he was mending a hinge on the barn door, The dog barked once and fell quiet. Calder looked up sharply. A figure moved along the ridge trail, slow, deliberate. A woman. She walked with one hand braced against her thigh, each step strained. Her deerskin dress was worn and torn, the neckline loose, the seam split across her side, exposing bronze skin and ribs that showed the weight she had lost. Beads and feathers dangled from the ends of her thick braids, swaying as she came closer. Her face carried high cheekbones, a sharp jaw, and eyes ringed with fatigue. She didn't call out, didn't raise her hands, only kept walking until she stopped a few yards from his door. "I look for child," she said, voice soft, words bent by accent. Calder gave a single nod and stepped aside. She entered without hesitation, and the girl stirred at once, whispering, "Mama." The woman fell to her knees, cradling her daughter, pressing lips to her forehead, murmuring in their tongue. The fire cracked shadows bending across the walls. Calder stood silent in the doorway, the weight of the moment settling. Then the woman lifted her eyes to him. "My name Ilani," she said, her gaze steady though rimmed with red. "You fed my daughter. In our way it means everything. I belong now if you take." Her words carried no desperation, no plea, only the still weight of tradition and choice. Calder's throat tightened. He had not asked for company, had not sought belonging, yet something in her tone told him the ridge would not remain as silent as before. Ilani stayed kneeling on the rug, her daughter clutched to her chest as though afraid the fire might vanish if she let go. Calder shifted his weight against the doorframe, the rough grain of pine digging into his shoulder. He studied her in silence, the shape of her words circling in his mind. "I belong now if you take." He had heard many vows in his life shouted on battlefields or whispered in chapels, but nothing sounded quite like this. It wasn't a promise, not even a plea. It was a statement old as the ridge itself. He wanted to tell her he didn't believe in traditions, that he had long ago turned his back on rituals and words carved into stone. But when he looked at her, at the split seam in her dress, at the bruises darkening her arms, at the way she gathered the child, as though her own body were the only fortress left, he couldn't brush it aside. Whatever she had endured, it had carved deep lines in her strength, and now she had placed that strength inside his cabin. The girl Ayani drifted back into sleep, her small face pressed into her mother's chest. Ilani rocked her gently, humming a tune that sounded both mournful and steady, a song older than memory. Calder didn't interrupt. He walked to the table, poured water into a cup, and set it near her without a word. She glanced once, then nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Hours passed without speech. Calder fed the animals, hauled in more wood, and each time he returned, he found them by the fire, mother mending, child sleeping. The cabin, once a place of silence, now breathed differently. It wasn't loud, but it was full. When dusk settled, he lit the lantern and set out a plate of beans and bread. Ilani accepted it, tearing pieces small for her daughter before eating herself. No waste, no noise, every gesture precise. Later, when Ayani slept again, Ilani looked up. "You live here long?" Her words were halting, shaped carefully, but they carried intent. Calder nodded. "5 winters." She lowered her gaze, fingertips tracing the rim of the tin plate. "Alone." He didn't answer, but silence was answer enough. The next morning, Calder woke to the smell of smoke layered thick in the air. Ilani was already at the hearth, adding wood with steady hands. She moved like someone who had done this all her life, feeding flame not for herself, but for the rhythm of a household. Ayani sat bundled in Calder's wool coat, small hands wrapped around a cup. Calder paused, watching. For the first time in years, he felt what it meant to enter his own cabin and find it alive. "You need clothes," he said quietly, nodding at the torn seams of Ilani's dress. She lifted her eyes, unreadable. "I fix," he gestured toward her ankle, swollen and discolored. "And boots." She looked down, then up again, voice even. "We walked far." 3 days. South. That was the first shard of her story dropped like a stone into still water. She didn't say who they ran from or what they had left behind. Calder didn't press. He had learned the hard way that forcing words only drove them deeper into silence. Instead, he set his jaw and made a plan. "I'll ride to town tomorrow," he said. "Dry goods. Boots for her. Thread for your dress." Ilani shook her head once. "No need." but her voice held no conviction, only fatigue. That evening, as the wind rose and rattled the shutters, Ayani curled near the hearth again, small fingers clutching a rag doll Ailani had sewn from scrap cloth. Calder sat at the table mending a harness strap, his hands moving slow, his mind restless. When Ailani's voice cut through the crackle of fire, he looked up. "My husband gone long ago," she said quietly. "We were with others. Apache, some good, some not. Then men came. White men, not soldiers, not law. They took food, blankets, wanted more." She stopped, her jaw, set eyes fixed on the flames. Calder felt the muscles in his neck tighten. He didn't ask what she saw, didn't demand the rest. She said only, "I ran with Ayani. They didn't chase. Too much trouble. But I saw." Her voice thinned, but it did not break. She looked at him, then steady, unashamed. "I come to you because you fed her. In our way, it means everything." Calder exhaled slowly. "I'm not a good man," he muttered. She shook her head once. "You alone. Only men with empty homes make space." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He didn't know how to answer, so he didn't. They stood outside later beneath a sky scattered with stars, silence stretching between them. She pulled a shawl close to the neckline of her dress, sagging low with wear, her skin marked by bruises. Calder kept his eyes on the horizon, but he felt her presence like a weight against the cold. They didn't move closer, didn't speak again, but neither of them felt quite as alone. The next day, Calder saddled his horse. Ayani ran to his side, her small legs crunching frost, and pressed a crude figure made of twine into his hand. "For you," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Calder closed his gloved fingers around it, the rough fibers cutting into his palm. "Thanks," he murmured. Ailani came up behind her daughter, one hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. "We wait," she said simply. It was 2 hours to town. Calder hadn't been back since spring, and he hated the eyes that followed him whenever he stepped inside the general store. But he knew what he needed: beans, salt, flour, boots small enough for Ayani's feet, fabric for Eleni's torn dress. When he found a second-hand coat lined with rabbit fur, he bought it without hesitation, though the shopkeep muttered it was barely worth $2. He rode back faster than he'd come, the sky dimming with early snow clouds. By the time he reached the ridge, darkness pressed in. The cabin glowed faintly with firelight, smoke curling steady from the chimney. Inside, Ayani sat cross-legged with a cup, Ailani stirring a pot over the flames. She turned as Calder entered, eyes steady. "You late," she said. He set the bundles down, pulled the coat free, and handed it to the girl. Her small gasp as she touched the fur was louder than any words. Ailani lifted it gently, turned it in her hands, then looked at Calder. "You thought of this, not just food." He didn't answer, didn't need to. Ailani stepped closer, bare feet soft against the wood floor, her voice low. "In my way, a man who feeds, protects, and brings warmth is not just shelter. He is home." Calder's chest tightened. He had sworn never to open his home again, never to let anyone pass the walls he had built with his own 2 hands. But as he stood there, the fire warming his back, Ayani clutching the coat to her chest, and Ailani standing close enough that he could feel the heat of her breath, he understood something had already shifted. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. But when he closed the door against the wind that night, it sounded less like a barrier and more like a vow. Morning came thin and quiet, the kind of light that only knows how to arrive by degrees, as if afraid to wake the land too fast. Calder rose before the stove had thrown off its chill, feeling the familiar catch in his knee as his weight shifted from the bedplank. He pulled on his boots without lacing them, padded to the hearth, and found that he was not first. Ailani knelt there, sleeves pushed to her elbows, feeding the fire with measured care. Ayani slept beneath Calder's old coat, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, breath warm against the wool. Ailani did not turn when he entered. The room carried the soft sounds of a home at work, wood creaking as it took to flame, a pot lid ticking as it settled, the quiet scrape of a spoon against iron. Calder watched a moment too long, the scene pricking something he had kept dull on purpose. After a while, he cleared his throat. The sound felt loud in the small room. "You should rest," he said, trying to make it gentle. "Your ankle is still swollen." "I will rest," Ailani answered, and tended the flames again. Her voice was simple, not stubborn. She tilted her foot, and he saw the swelling had gone down only a little. She did not complain. He did not push. He filled the kettle and hung it over the hook, then lifted the latch of the small pantry. The inventory pressed itself into his mind, a habit born of years alone. Flour was low, beans half a sack, salt enough for a week. Jerky or fresh meat would be needed soon, but the weather was turning, and the ridge liked to keep what it took. "We will need to stretch what we have," he said. Elani nodded. "I can make stew last." She gestured to a small cloth parcel on the table. "I saved bone and onion." The way she said saved made him feel both ashamed of the waste he had once let happen and grateful in the same breath. When Ayani woke, she sat up, slow blinking, as if the world might vanish if she looked too quick. Calder crouched so his eyes were level with hers. "Hungry little bird?" he asked. She nodded once, solemn, then lifted the rabbit fur coat and pressed her face into it. He felt a tug near his ribs that had nothing to do with his old wound. Ilani measured beans into the pot, added water, a pinch of salt. Her hands moved with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to make small things last. When she reached for a tear in her dress and began threading a needle, Calder noticed how she angled herself toward the fire so the light could find the rip. How she kept Ayani in the edge of her sight without turning her head. That small vigilance had weight. "You are good with your hands," he said. "Work makes them know what to do," she replied and tied off a stitch as neat as a seamstress. The day unfurled into tasks simple and necessary. Calder showed Ilani the shed where he kept the grain and tools. She watched the latch once, and then opened it herself as if memorizing the movement for later. He lifted a sack to his shoulder, and she took the other side without being asked. When they reached the pen, she steadied the bucket while he poured and their knuckles brushed. Both of them pulled back as if burned not from shame, but from the surprise of being reminded of skin. After chores, when the sun cleared the far pines and laid a thin glow over the yard, Calder set to fixing the warped plank on the porch step. Every strike of the hammer sent little flurries of frost into the air. Ayani sat on the top step with a broken-handled brush and stroked the pony's winter coat, her small voice humming a tune that had no words. Every now and then, she would glance at Calder, look away, then glance again, as if she were deciding whether the world made sense when he was inside it. Ilani took her mending to the stoop and worked legs tucked beneath her ankle stretched out to keep pressure from it. The neckline of her dress still sagged, and Calder forced himself to look only at the needle and thread, at the quiet patience of her fingers. When she caught him watching, she held his gaze for a breath that felt longer than it was, then went back to her work. The moment did not break anything. It placed something in the room that had not been there before. Near midday, clouds shouldered over the ridge and began to lower themselves into the valley. The wind, which had been only a murmur, found its voice. Calder stood, hammer at his side, and studied the sky like a man used to bargaining with weather. "We will get a skiff of snow before dusk," he said. Ilani did not waste words. "What do you need?" It was not a question that asked to be convinced. It was a question that asked to be useful. He hesitated more from old habit than lack of answer. "We need to chink that gap above the window and lay tar cloth where the roof seam drips. I will climb. You hold ladder." He caught himself and stopped. "Your ankle." "I can hold a ladder," she said. The simple shape of the words made it hard to argue. They worked until their breath smoked. He climbed and set the cloth, tapping nails in with a measured hand so the shingles would not split in the cold. Below, Ilani kept the ladder steady and watched for any shift in the wind that might try to take him. Twice he glanced down and found her looking up, not afraid, only ready. When the last nail sat flush, he climbed down, slow boots, stiff shoulders, tight from the climb. They stood close a moment, caught between thanks and the fact that thanks felt too small for what it meant to be steadied by another human being. Inside, Ayani had lined 3 charred sticks on the hearthstone and declared them horses. She set the little twine figure beside them, as if to say the man who received the gift should be part of their game. Calder lowered himself to the floor, ignoring the protest of his knee, and moved one of the stick horses with 2 fingers. Ayani watched, mouth turning up at one corner, in a smile she tried to swallow back. She moved another horse to meet his, and they circled each other like riders who had not yet decided if they were friends. The stew turned out thin but warm. The 3 of them ate close to the fire with tin spoons that clicked soft against the bowls. When the wind shouldered the cabin and the first flakes thumbed the window glass, Calder added wood to the stove, then set a second log because the sound of it settling soothed something in him he had not named. The day slid toward evening in that unremarkable way. Days do when survival is not a fight, but a series of small loyalties performed without fanfare. After they cleaned the bowls, Calder took the harness he had been mending the night before and sat at the table. His hands were clumsy with tiredness, the leather stiff with chill, and the needle bit his thumb more than once. He cursed under his breath. Ilani watched from the hearth, then rose and came to him. "May I?" she asked. He passed the strap. Her fingers read the tier like a map, pressed the split flat and stitched with strokes, so even they looked printed. "You pulled too hard," she said without accusation. He huffed a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You fix what you can by force when you are alone." Her eyes lifted. "And when you are not alone, you learn where to be strong and where to be gentler," he said, and realized he had told the truth out loud. When Ayani drifted to sleep near the stove, they carried her pallet to a warmer corner and tucked the rabbit coat over her. The wind worried at the eaves, but the roof seam did not drip. Calder stood with one hand on the back of a chair, missing a beat in his breath at how simple a victory could feel. Ilani wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch, leaving the door open, so lamplight followed her out. Calder hesitated, then joined her. Snow lifted and twisted in the yard, a restless dance under a sky that had no color. The fields lay quietly under their new skin. They stood side by side, close but not touching, and watched the ridge disappear a little at a time. After a while, Calder said, "When I came here, I thought quiet would cure me. It did not. It only made the old noises louder." "I know that quiet," Ilani said, "the kind that does not bless, only empties." He turned his head just enough to see her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the set of her mouth that spoke of endurance without boasting. The shawl slipped as the wind pulled, and he saw the seam she had repaired earlier, neat and tight. It comforted him to know things could be mended and hold. The door creaked behind them, and Ayani's cough rose thin from the room. Not fevered, not frightening, but present. Calder reached inside for the kettle, poured warm water into a cup, and handed it to Ilani. She took it and disappeared into the lamplight. He lingered, watching the snow decide what kind of storm it wanted to be. Later, when the wind settled to a steady breath, and the stove had the room at a bearable heat, Calder laid his bedroll across the floor by the hearth. He had slept there more nights than he could count, as if his body refused to claim the bed where absence had once been a fourth presence. He straightened the blanket and felt foolish for doing it with more care than necessary. Ilani noticed and paused with her hands on the edge of Ayani's pallet. "You do not sleep in the bed," she said. "Not often." The words came out more bare than he meant. She nodded as if that made sense. Then she carried a second blanket from the shelf and placed it near his bedroll. She did not say for whom. She did not have to. The stove ticked as metal cooled and heated in small cycles. The snow tapped messages on the roof. From somewhere in the walls, a mouse tested a path and changed its mind. Calder lay on his back, eyes on the ceiling, and listened to the new arithmetic of the room, each sound an added number he had told himself he could live without. He realized now he had wanted them. Through the half-light, he watched Ilani sit at the table with her needle one last time, closing the gap at her side. She adjusted the neckline higher, testing the laces, then sighed as if the cloth itself had exhaled. When she looked up, he was already facing the fire, trying not to make meaning out of the simple act of a woman deciding how she wished to be seen. Sleep came slow, but it came. Just before it did, Ayani murmured a word in her language and turned beneath her coat. The sound had the softness of a nest. Calder closed his eyes on that sound and let the storm walk around the cabin while the three of them lay inside it. Not loud, not quiet, but full. The storm rolled itself thin by dawn, leaving a crust of snow across the ridge, and a silence heavy enough to hear the rafters breathe. Calder woke stiff, the fire reduced to faint coals. He pulled himself up, slow, knee-aching, and added wood until the flames stretched tall again. Behind him, Ayani stirred on her pallet, small cough breaking the hush. Ilani was already awake, sitting cross-legged by the table, hair undone from its heavy braid, fingers weaving a strip of cloth she had cut from one of his old sacks. "Morning," Calder said low. Her eyes lifted, steady but calm. "Morning," she answered, and knotted the cloth with a neat twist. Ayani crawled into her mother's lap, still wrapped in the rabbit fur coat. Her eyes flicked toward Calder, uncertain, then lingered. He set a tin of water near her. She sipped, then whispered thank you, her accent small but clear. It struck him harder than he expected, that fragile sound of gratitude. After chores, Calder saddled his horse. Snow clung to the cinch, stiff and reluctant, but he worked it through. Ilani came out with her shawl tight, Ayani holding her skirt. Town Calder said, "We need supplies." He paused, then added, "You'll be safe here." The words were more vow than statement. Ilani's eyes darkened for a moment, but she only nodded. "We wait," she said again. The ride into Sundown Flats took longer in snow. Calder kept his eyes low when he entered. The store gave the list in measured tones: flour beans, salt needles, boots small enough for a child. He didn't explain, didn't offer reasons. Thad the shopkeep looked at him sideways when Calder asked about fabric, quilting, cotton, and scraps that said. Calder took them all. Before leaving, he saw a girl's coat on a peg, patched and near threadbare, but lined in rabbit fur. $2, that muttered. Calder paid without bargaining. On the ride back, clouds sank low and the wind picked up its teeth. Calder pressed the horse harder, heart driving against his ribs. He hated the way time stretched when someone waited at home. When he reached the ridge, dusk had already laid its shadow. No smoke rose from the chimney. He dismounted fast, untied the packs, and pushed through the cabin door. Inside, the fire burned steady, Ayani cross-legged on the floor, a tin cup in her hands. Ilani stood behind her, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon. She turned, slow eyes meeting his. "You late," she said. Not anger, not relief, just fact. Calder set the bundles down, pulled out the coat, and handed it to the girl. Ayani gasped, clutching the fur to her cheek. Ilani touched the coat with both hands, then looked at Calder. "You thought of this, not just food." Something in her voice slid beneath his guard. Calder had no answer, so he said nothing. He only shut the door, the click echoing like a vow. That night, after the girl slept wrapped in her new coat, Calder stepped outside. Stars pricked the sky hard and cold, coyotes crying from the far hills. He leaned against the porch, post-breath, clouding white. A moment later, Eleni joined him, shawl pulled close. They stood in silence side by side. At length she spoke, voice low. "My husband gone long ago. We were with others, Apache, some good, some not. Then men came, white men, not soldiers. They took food blankets. Wanted more." She paused, eyes on the snow. "I ran with Ayani. Too much trouble to chase, but I saw what they did." Her voice thinned, but did not break. Calder's jaw clenched. He wanted to ask more, but he knew better. Some truths cut deeper when dragged into daylight. "He only said you're safe here." Ilani turned to him, steady gaze under the starlight. "You gave her food. In our way, that means everything." Calder let out a breath rough. "I'm not a good man." "You are alone," she replied. "Only men with empty homes make space." The words settled heavy, yet not unkind. They stood there a long while, snow creaking beneath its own weight. Neither moved closer, neither stepped back. The night carried them both without answer. The next days passed with rhythm, a shape they had not chosen but began to learn. Ilani mended seams with thread. Calder had brought every stitch clean. Ayani swept the floor with a pine broom. Calder carved from a branch, her small steps careful, her hum soft. Calder cut wood, tended animals, kept the fire burning bright. Each act alone was survival. Together they began to look like living. One evening, while Ayani slept, curled near the hearth, Calder worked a cracked harness at the table. The leather split under his hands, needle slipping. He cursed under his breath. Ilani rose, crossed the room, and took it gently. Her fingers traced the tear, then stitched smooth, every pull steady. "You pull too hard," she said, no judgment in her tone. Calder watched her hands move, calm and sure. When you are alone, you fix with force. When you are not alone, you can be gentler. The words caught him off guard. He looked at her, but she kept her eyes on the leather. When she tied the final knot, she laid it back in his hands. Her palm brushed his briefly. Neither spoke of it. Later that night, when the wind pressed hard at the shutters, Calder spread his bedroll near the fire. Ilani watched from Ayani's side, then carried a second blanket and laid it near his. She didn't say whose it was for. She didn't have to. The storm rattled outside, but inside the cabin, the air felt different, full, steady, alive. Calder lay awake longer than he meant to, listening to the soft cadence of two other breaths mingling with his own. For the first time in years, silence did not sound like absence. It sounded like shelter. The storm loosened its grip by midday and left the woods dripping, every branch beaded with thaw. Calder shoveled a narrow path from the cabin to the barn, pushing aside slush that had turned heavy as wet wool. The shoveled lines made a corridor of dark earth in a pale world, and something about that order steadied him. When he came back inside, steam ghosted from his coat. Ilani stood by the stove sleeves, rolled ladling a thin broth into 3 bowls. Ayani's cough had gone to a dry rasp and then softened. Now she sipped without flinching, the rabbit fur collar high against her chin. Eat, Ilani said, not as command, not as apology, only as a way of keeping the room alive. Calder held the bowl between both palms, letting the heat travel into bones that winter insisted on numbering. They ate in the hush that comes when a house has learned the new names of its people but isn't ready to speak them out loud. After a while, Ayani traced tiny circles on the frosted window. With one fingertip, Ilani drew the chair beside the table and folded her hands as if to keep them from drifting. "There are things I did not tell you," she said. The room took the sentence and placed it carefully between them. Calder set his cup down and waited. "We did not only walk from other camps," she went on. "South of here far as a trading place, not on maps. Men who sell fur and sometimes girls." Her eyes didn't search for pity. She spoke like a woman laying out tools. "I worked there a season to eat," kept Ayani quiet, "and I thought I was stone. But stone cracks." When the man, she flicked her gaze toward the door, as if the name were outside somewhere learned. "She is mine, an Apache," he said. More coin would come from her. "I cut him." Took Ayani ran. Snow came early. It covered our steps. Maybe it swallowed their will, maybe only their horses' lungs. I do not know, but I know this. If they come, they will not wear law. Calder's jaw set slow. The ridge seemed to shift a fraction closer around the cabin, as if to listen harder. He let the picture form, let it fill him with the right kind of anger, the kind that made a man build and prepare, not burn and waste. "You told me because you would not let me keep you without knowing what I keep," he said. "Yes," she answered. "You deserve the choice." He looked at the rifle perched above the door, at the extra nails he had driven into the latch, at the path he had carved through snow so that small feet could run without tripping. "I chose the day I opened the door," he said. "That will stand." She watched him in a way that neither praised nor tested, only measured. Then she rose, crossed to the hearth, and lifted the iron lid to feed the flame. It flared briefly, copper and wide. Ayani leaned her head to the warm stone and exhaled, as if the cabin itself had a pulse she could hear. That afternoon, Calder brought the Henry to the table and opened it, piece by piece, laying the parts in a neat line, like letters of a word he still remembered how to read. He cleaned the bore, checked the springs, oiled the action until it worked smooth under his thumb. Ilani sat opposite, mending the last stubborn seam at her side, her stitches crossing the broken cloth with patience that made the gap disappear. They said very little. What needed saying was in the way they placed each tool, each scrap, each clean rag. When he reassembled the rifle and set it back in its place, they both glanced toward the door without meaning to, as if to greet the future like a stranger who might be friend or trouble. Dusk arrived early and honest. Clouds stacked over the valley and pressed the light thin. Calder lit the lantern and hung it so it didn't tilt the flame cupped inside glass. Ayani asked for a story in a voice that barely dared to want something. Ilani's mouth turned at the corners. "I know only songs," she said, story inside them. Ayani nodded as if that were better anyway. So Ilani sang soft and low a song, with long paths in it, a song that did not fight the night but walk through it. Calder did not understand the words, but he knew by the weight of them that someone had once sung the same melody to a child who had slept without fear. When the last note fell, the room seemed to hold it and then tuck it under the floorboards for later. After Ayani slept, Calder stepped onto the porch to judge the wind. The sky had that hard shine that sometimes comes before deeper cold. He leaned a shoulder to the post, the wood familiar against the scar on his collarbone. He did not hear the door open, only felt the shift of air. When Ilani came to stand beside him, shawl pulled close. For a time they were quiet. He wanted to place his hand over hers where it held the edge of the wool to see if the heat moved across that small distance the way it seemed to. He did not. Tell me your wife's name, she said at last, simple as a man asking what time remains before night. He did not expect the request to land like a mercy. Sarah, he said. Ilani nodded, like a woman adding two and two. You loved her? Yes. And you do not carry her like an axe anymore. You carry her like a braid. The words were so exactly true he nearly laughed. Instead he said, I thought if I slept in the bed, the old house would build itself back around me and then collapse. She glanced toward the unmade bed behind the open door. Houses do not collapse from being used, she said. They collapse from being empty. He said nothing. Some sentences do not need answers so much as breath. They stood until their cheeks stung. When they went back in, they moved quietly so as not to wake the girl. Calder spread his bedroll near the stove like always, but he did it without that old care that pretended it was for comfort when it was only fear. He lay down the floor telling his spine what it had told him for years. The lantern hissed once and settled. He was halfway to sleep when he heard the rustle of cloth and the soft pad of bare feet. He kept his eyes open only because closing them seemed like hiding. Ilani stood in the half-light and looked at him, then at the bed, then at him again. She did not ask a question. She set an answer in the space. She laid a folded blanket near his shoulder and slid down onto the floor, a hand's breadth away, her head toward the stove, her feet toward the door, as if she meant to be between him and whatever would come through it. Her shawl smelled of smoke and cedar. The heat from her body reached his skin without touching. Sleep came in a clean line. In the morning, a pale thaw clung to the window, and the kettle wore a soft coat of steam. Calder rose to find that Ilani had already boiled water and set a pinch of herbs to steep. Ayani's cough had backed into the corners. Calder laced his boots and went out to split wood the rhythm sounder, for knowing someone would catch the logs before they rolled off the block. Ilani did exactly that, her ankles steadier, her stance firm as a fence post. When the last log cracked clean, their fingers met in the same space and they both stopped, their breath visible. It felt less like a touch and more like a sentence finished together. After chores, Calder drew a rough map into the dust on the table with the blunt end of a spoon. If trouble comes, he said, you take the barn path. Keep the wall to your left, use the stall doors as cover. Cross the dry creek where the willow leans. There is a cut in the fence I never fixed. Through that is a shallow draw and a line of stone. Follow it north and the ridge itself hides you. He looked up to see if the words lodged. They did. Ilani traced each mark with her finger once, and then blew gently across the dust, setting the plan into the air like flour. Good, she said. And you, I will not be far behind. That afternoon, he rode to the lower meadow to check the fence line, while Ilani and Ayani sorted the shelves and folded the strips of fabric into something like order. When he returned, the cabin looked as if it had remembered how to be useful. Hooks cleared a broken hinge, set aside to be mended, kindling bundled so small hands could carry it. Ayani had drawn 4 stubborn stars in charcoal on the hearthstone. When Calder knelt to warm his fingers, he found himself smiling at them without deciding to. That evening brought a cloud ceiling low enough to touch. They ate cornbread and broth, and then sat where the fire could paint their faces. The space between Calder and Ilani changed by inches, not feet. When she leaned to lift the pot, her shoulder brushed his sleeve and stayed a heartbeat longer than need required. When he set his cup down, his knuckles brushed the back of her hand and did not retreat like a startled animal. Ayani watched with the solemn mischief of a child who can smell a thing before it has a name. She said nothing about it, only placed the twine doll between their cups like a small treaty. Night asked its old question, where do we sleep? This time Ilani did not bring a blanket to the floor. She looked at the bed, then at him. If I sleep there, she said, it is because I choose it, not because I owe it. His answer came before he could find a prettier one. Yes. She lifted Ayani to the bed first and settled the girl near the wall tucked under the heavy quilt. Then she slid beneath the blanket on the outer edge and left a long, careful space that felt like a road. Calder stood at the foot, one hand on the bedpost, old habit climbing his throat with its ghosts. He let the habit pass without feeding it. He lay down on top of the blanket, boots off, shirt on the distance between their bodies, a promise rather than a wall. They did not speak. The stove ticked. Wind fingered the chinks and then slipped away. Somewhere far off, an owl made a single sound and thought better of saying more. In the warm dark, Calder felt the bed take his weight and refused to turn it into grief. A minute later, maybe two, Ilani's hand found his forearm and rested there light as a yes. He did not move closer. He did not have to. The yes was enough to sleep on. The next day would bring a new cold or a thaw, or the sight of riders on a far slope. The ridge would be the ridge, and men who wanted would continue wanting. But that night a house held 3 breaths and did not empty. And in the hush that followed, Calder learned that belonging does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives like a second blanket, and the room is warmer, and you only notice your hands stop shaking when you go to use them, and they do exactly what you asked. The ridge woke under a sky the color of tin, a thin sheet of cloud pressing low as though the world were waiting for something it had not yet named. Calder split kindling by the shed, the clean crack of cedar carrying across the yard. Each swing steadied his pulse, each sharp report reminding him he still had rhythm to follow. When he turned, he saw Ayani crouched by the porch, coaxing a circle of small stones into place. She looked up at him and grinned for the first time, quick and crooked, before ducking her head again. The sight took him unprepared, like stumbling on water in a dry gulch. Ailani stood in the doorway, shawl drawn, but eyes awake. She was mending again, a strip of cloth in her lap, needle flashing, when it caught the pale light. Her face had less shadow in it than the day she arrived. Calder wondered if she noticed. He didn't ask. Sometimes speaking the truth too early sent it running. By mid-morning, the 3 of them worked side by side in a rhythm that felt almost practiced. Ayani fed chickens with grain. He had poured her small hands, scattering with care. Ailani swept the porch, pausing when her ankle tightened, but refusing to stop. Calder hauled water from the well-setting buckets inside with more force than needed, trying to bury the old habit of counting only his own needs. When the chores were done, the cabin looked not new but awake, as if walls and rafters had been waiting for sound beyond the scratch of one man's boots. After the meal, Calder took the rifle down and checked it again, not from fear but because readiness had become a second spine. Ilani watched her sewing, paused in her lap. "You expect them," she said, not sharp, not timid, simply naming. "I expect the world to remember us," Calder answered. She nodded once, then bent back to her work, the needle stitching a truth of its own. That afternoon, he walked the corral fence, tightening slack wire testing posts. When he looked back, he saw Ailani on the porch steps, Ayani tucked against her side. The girl hummed while her mother braided her hair with steady hands, weaving strands with bits of ribbon torn from the scrap bundle. The braids shone dark as wet river rock beads glinting where Ailani knotted them in. The sight struck Calder with such sudden weight that he gripped the post harder than he meant to. He realized this place no longer looked like solitude. It looked like a home under construction. The cold sharpened as the sun dipped the ridge, turning brittle. Calder set traps near the lower draw for rabbit, his breath misting. When he came back, the cabin glowed gold through the frost. He stood a moment outside, letting the warmth inside call him, rather than rushing. When he finally opened the door, the smell of stew and fire pulled through him, like something he'd forgotten he could want. Ayani looked up from the hearth and smiled again, wider this time. Ailani ladled stew into bowls, her sleeves pushed high, her hair falling forward as if the cabin's air had softened her. They ate together, not rushed. Ayani counted the carrots in her bowl aloud. Ilani listened as though each number held ceremony. Calder found himself smiling at nothing, then caught himself. The habit of guarding joy was still strong, but it was losing its grip. After the bowls were cleaned and stacked, Calder sat by the fire with a harness strap needing repair. His hands moved, slow, eyes half on the flames. Ilani crossed the room and sat opposite her, dress, mended higher now, neckline laced modestly, but her presence carrying the same quiet pull. She set a small bundle on the table rags she had pieced into a crude doll for Ayani. Her fingers smoothed the seams, then set it gently aside. She looked up at Calder and said in our way, "When a child plays again, it means she has roots." He nodded the truth of it, needing no argument. His gaze lingered on her longer than he meant. She didn't look away. The silence between them thickened, not heavy but ripe. Ayani, curled with the new doll in her arms, had already drifted to sleep. The fire snapped, once showering sparks inside the grate. Later, when Calder stepped out to check the sky, Ailani followed. The moon pressed silver across the snow, bright enough to cast shadows. She drew the shawl tighter but let the neckline slip low. Not careless, not calculated, simply unbothered. He looked, then forced himself to look away, not out of shame, but because desire felt too near to reverence. She turned to him after a long quiet. "You had ghosts in your sleep," before she said. "Last night you did not." He studied her, unsure how to answer. Her gaze held steady. "I am not afraid of men," she said softly. "I am afraid of what men think they own." Calder's jaw worked. "I don't own you." "Not yet," she replied, and though the words could have cut, they didn't. They hung in the cold air like a fact waiting to be rewritten. He swallowed once his throat dry. "You're not here because I claimed you," he said. "I know," she answered. "I'm here because you didn't." The words loosened something inside him he had kept bolted for years. He exhaled into the night, breath clouding, and for the first time in longer than he could mark, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like space making itself ready. When they went back inside, the girl stirred but did not wake. Ilani bent and tucked the coat higher over Ayani's shoulders, then straightened eyes on Calder. Her hand brushed his arm as she passed the touchlight, but enough to change the shape of the room. He stayed still, not chasing it, not denying it. The fire threw long shadows across the walls, and in those shadows a house that had once belonged to sorrow learned it could belong to something else. The morning carried a quiet that felt earned, the kind that arrives only after a house has learned how to breathe with more than one set of lungs. Calder stepped into the yard with the Henry balanced easy in his hands, not as a threat but as a habit a man keeps when the past has long arms. Frost clung to the fence posts and flashed dull in the pale sun. He walked the line twice, listened for what did not belong, and found only the small noises of a place that had decided to go on living. Inside the cabin had a different sound now, a low song of work and warmth. Ione sat by the hearth with a twine doll and two sticks she called horses, speaking to them in a patient whisper that had no fear in it. Ailani sorted cloth and stacked it by size, humming under her breath, not to ward off dread, but because the tune asked to be sung. When Calder came back in, he stood a long heartbeat and let the scene print itself across the hollow places in him. "We should go to town soon," he said at last, "because truths lose shape if they are not spoken. Flour will run low. The fence wire needs replacing near the south corner." And he hesitated not for lack of words, but because he understood their weight. "And I will put our names in the book." He did not dress the sentence in other cloth. He did not ask if she wanted what he offered. He waited. Ilani's hand stilled. A flicker crossed her face. Not fear, not surprise, more like relief arriving late and finding the door still open. "Names," she repeated. "A ledger," he said. "A public thing. Eyes will look. Some will not be kind, but the ink will hold." She studied him with the calm appraisal of a woman who has measured men by more than their promises. "I do not fear eyes," she said. "Only hands that claim without asking." Then her mouth turned at one corner. "Ink is only a different kind of looking. If we choose it, it is ours." They went 2 days later because weather likes to test every plan. The road down was patched with melt and freeze. The ruts glazed in places like old glass. Calder set Ayani in front of him in the saddle and felt the small weight of her lean into his chest, trusting the way children trust when the body learns before the mind. Ilani rode behind on the mare, her posture steady, her hair braided clean beads catching faint light. Sundown Flats watched them arrive the way a small town watches anyone who changes the angle of a street. The bell above the store gave its half-hearted rattle. A teamster on the porch lifted his chin and then pretended he had meant to look at the sky. Calder guided the horse past the saloon, past the blacksmith where steam rose off a hot shoe dropped in water, and stopped at the clerk's office with its lopsided sign and window dust that never seemed to thin. Inside, the clerk peered over wire spectacles, expression cautious as a man who rents out words for a living and makes you sign for the ones you take. Calder gave their names. The man repeated them slowly, the pen hovering. Calder felt a slow burn along his collarbone, where the scar always itched and cold. He kept his voice level. "Write them together," he said. The clerk looked up, once eyes flicking past Calder's shoulder to where Eleni stood with her shawl gathered and her head unbowed, then back to the page. He set the tip to the paper and shaped letters that would outlast the weather. When it was done, the clerk pushed the ledger across the desk for signatures. Ailani took the pen without fuss, lips moving around the letters as if tasting a new spice, and wrote her name with a care that made the ink look heavier. Ayani watched serious as a witness. Calder signed last, the familiar sweep of his hands steadying the room. When they stepped back into the street, the same teamster on the porch had decided he had business, staring at his boots. Calder took Ailani's hand where anyone could see and did not look away from any glance that rose to meet his. They rode home lighter, not because the packs were full, but because the ridge seemed closer now, as if the land itself had answered back to a quiet question they had long carried. The cabin opened to them without complaint. Ayani leapt down and ran for the pen to count chickens, her voice high with the work of it. Calder led the horses through and stripped the tack with the ease of a man who remembers why tasks matter. He found himself humming the curl of one of Ailani's songs without knowing he had learned it. Days quickened into themselves. The sky threw down a last hard cold and then relented. Ice cracked along the creek in a sound like thin glass snapping. Calder mended the roof seam he had sworn at all. Winter drove the last nails with a certain hand and came down the ladder to find Ailani waiting with a tin cup of coffee that had not cooled. She handed it over and did not take her eyes from his face. Something in her gaze anchored him so cleanly he forgot to look away. That night, she told him she suspected a child had already started inside her, not as a fear or an apology, but as an announcement made to a partner in the laying in of stores. He set the cup down and touched her hand with the back of his fingers, as if to learn the truth by listening through her skin. "You sure?" he asked, voice rough with everything he did not want to say wrong. "I know the shape," she said, and she laid his palm low against her belly where the warmth pooled. It was not a miracle to him so much as a decision taking root. He believed in the kind of grace that arrives wearing work clothes. After that time braided itself. Calder built a small cradle from pine sanding, the rails slow careful to find every splinter and smooth it down until his hand could travel without catching. Ailani dyed scraps of cloth with crushed berries and onion skins, then cut and pieced them into a small quilt that looked like a sky teaching itself new colors. Ayani practiced the lullaby she liked least until it no longer caught in her throat because she had decided the baby would need even the hard songs. At night, when the ridge breathed fog along the ground, Calder and Ailani spoke low about where to plant and how much grain to hold back and what kind of name fit a child who would be born into a house that had rebuilt itself. Once late in that soft part of the night when the fire has settled into its quietest work, Calder woke to find Ailani watching him. Not with worry, not with fear, only watchful in the generous way a person can be when they no longer count moments against themselves. "You do not shake anymore when you sleep," she said. His mind reached back instinctively for the excuses he had carried like talismans and found them tired. "Not when you are here," he said, and the simplicity of it did not embarrass him. There were small tests that came like weather. A rider paused on the far slope one afternoon and watched the place as if he had misplaced something in it. Calder stood in the yard and did nothing showy. He set a log on the chopping block and split it in one stroke, then another, the rhythm indifferent to the gaze. The rider waited, turned, and rode the long way around. 2 days later, a fox took one of the chickens, and Ailani mended the fence with the swiftness of a woman who understands both loss and remedy. They did not pretend the world had been made soft for them. They simply refused to be made brittle by it. When thaw came for true, the creek ran loud enough to steal talk out of the yard. The first shoots pushed up brave and green, the color almost painful against the memory of white. Calder took Ailani to the lower meadow and showed her how to read the ground for holes and stones where boot leather will betray you. She looked up at him with her brow pinched in the way that meant questions stacked up behind her teeth. He answered the ones he could and taught her that good questions know how to wait. On a dusk that smelled of wet pine and new earth, Ailani stood at the door and called them in. Her hair was loose for once, not braided for the day's work. He understood that she had chosen to let it fall, not for him exactly, but for herself in a house where that choice was safe. Later, with the sky dark and the stove ticking, she drew him closer by the simple act of taking his wrist and setting his hand on the curve of her waist. The bone and muscle under his palm felt like a kind of geography he wished to learn slowly. When they lay together, it was less a victory than a homecoming, not conquest but consent. Afterwards, she slept with her hand on his chest, and he slept without dreaming of rooms that collapsed. Spring stepped into itself fully, the world a little louder each week. Calder rode into town once more with Ilani beside him and Ayani in front, and this time the bell over the store door complained the same way it did for anyone else. A woman outside the dressmaker looked them over and then looked away with the mechanical embarrassment of someone who feels a habit die in her throat. Calder bought a bolt of blue cotton from a traveling cart and later cut it down for Ilani as best he could, measuring not with tape, but with the long practice of paying attention. The dress fit because he had been watching without taking. When the baby kicked under his hand, for the first time the feel of it turned the room so bright he had to look away. Ilani laughed low and covered his fingers with hers. He understood then that belonging can arrive in 1,000 small signatures, and that one of them is the press of a future against your palm. The boy came on a high summer noon, when the heat made even the flies give up argument. The labor was long but stubborn, the way the mother was, the way the ridge had always been. Calder held water to her lips and spoke her name, the way a man speaks to a horse he respects, not to push, but to praise. When the child cried, the sound cleaned the rafters of old dust. Calder wept without shame, not for grief, not for fear, but for the way relief sometimes breaks a man open, so it can pour a new thing in. They named him Samuel, and Ayani insisted on a second name in her mother's tongue that Calder learned to say by practicing alone in the yard until he could give it the right length of wind. By fall, the cabin no longer remembered how to sound empty. The cradle wore a smooth polish where hands had rocked it. The hearthstone held new stars Ayani had drawn for luck. The chair Calder built creaked in a way that told him he had used wood from 2 slightly stubborn trees and that the chair forgave him. At night, when the wind leaned hard and the door latch caught clean, Calder would curl an arm around Ilani and lay the other across the small body sleeping between them, and feel with a steadiness he had believed lost to him forever that nothing in the room belonged to him, and yet everything in it did. Not because he had claimed it, but because it had chosen to stay.